All right, today you are going to watch a podcast on the Chapter 8 notes. This is starting our government unit. And you have to take a minute and think of where our country stood at the time that the government was needing to be established. Remember that the American colonists, with the help of the French, had just defeated the British Crown and the best army and navy in the world. So there needed a time and point for a constitution to be established. As you can see in your notes, a constitution is a document that sets out the laws and principles of the government. The first constitution in the United States was called the Articles of Confederation. In this, many states wanted to write their own constitutions. Remember, a confederation is a loose alliance of the states. And what we'll soon find out is that the Articles of Confederation had many problems. At the time when it was established, it sounded like a good idea. Soon we'll examine some of the issues and then what the colonists did to try and correct those wrongs. The Articles of Confederation ends up creating a federal or central government that was weak under the Articles of Confederation. You'll read in your textbook, there'll be about 9 or 10 different reasons. Some of the highlights is that Congress had little economic power. There was no president, so there wasn't one person who was able to lead and take charge and help in decision making. Also, it was up to the states to enforce the laws. So the federal government in a whole was very, very weak. It actually gave more power to the states. Congress could not tax, so there was no way to raise money for the entire nation. And 9 out of the 13 states had to agree to pass laws, either between states or foreign powers. States all had different money systems, so a pretty common mistake is that if you say you lived around Binghamton and you were in the New York, Pennsylvania border, you'd have New York dollars. And if you were, say, a pig farmer and went across state borders into Pennsylvania and wanted to sell some of your pigs, that person would probably pay you in Pennsylvania dollars. But Pennsylvania dollars don't really matter to a New Yorker, so there became many complications with the money systems. Congress could not regulate trade between states or foreign powers. So as you can see, there's a couple different mistakes that the people made when creating the Articles of Confederation. Although there were some more disappointments of the Articles of Confederation, there were a couple of successes. In 1785, there was the Land Ordinance. This set up a system for settling the Northwest Territory. If you guys take a minute and look at the map on our wall that was painted, this is the whole green section. This was what was being fought over during in the Ohio River Valley for the French and Indian War. It separated regions into territories and created townships. These townships were split into sections, and these sections were sold to settlers. And what ends up happening is you're going to need about 60,000 people or residents in a general region to apply for statehood. So it's not until, if you look at the time, 1785, it's not until about the 1790s that we start to get states that are in the green section, like Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, even Alabama and Mississippi, which will come way later. So the Northwest Ordinance set up a government for the Northwest Territory. It set up basic rights, which was helpful for ruling in those territories. It also gave rights to settlers, and it banned slavery. So there was no slavery in the Northwest Territory. One of the major issues that took place during the Articles of Confederation that showed that the Articles were very weak was called Shays' Rebellion. During this, farmers were angry over Congress's inability to handle economic issues. At the time, farmers had borrowed money to buy farms and equipment, much like taking a loan from a bank today. At the time, because there was no ability to handle economic issues, there was an economic depression, which meant unemployment rose, which meant more people were out of work. The prices for goods fell, and farmers could not repay the loans. So what ended up happening was, this part here first, is that the courts tried to seize the farms, which means the courts tried to take the farms from the farmers. In an effort to prevent this, you see that there was a man named Daniel Shea, who's the person who organized this uprising. They tried to capture an arsenal, and if you remember from earlier chapters, an arsenal is where they store military weapons, guns, ammunition. And Daniel Shea leads a rebellion in Boston. He attacks courthouses in an effort to protect the farms. But what ends up happening is that the Massachusetts state militia, you can see over here, the state army, has to come in and has to drive them out. So it shows that a bunch of unruly farmers could raise such a havoc, but the major issue was under the Articles of Confederation, they couldn't help with the economy. So unemployment rises, prices fall, and farmers can't repay their loans. And at the time, remember, a lot of people were farmers. With that being said, there was definitely a need for change. The Articles of Confederation created a federal government that was far too weak to handle what the 13 colonies had created. So, in an attempt to make things better, delegates from each colony met at a constitutional convention to change the Articles of Confederation. Their initial idea was to change them, modify them, make them better. Instead, what they end up doing is they take the Articles of Confederation and they completely scrap them, they throw them out, and they're going to start over from scratch. At the Constitutional Convention, this was held in Philadelphia. The talks were held secret, and each state had different needs and concerns. We're going to talk about that here in a moment. They were creating a representative government. So there's two groups that are divided. You have one group, and for this, you actually have to write this down. There's not a spot on your notes for this, so I would write this probably right underneath the compromise or right next to big question number 1. Just jot down a couple notes. We're going to revisit this in chapter 9 as well. So you have two groups. You have the first one, the Anti-Federalists, anti meaning against. These people opposed the Constitution. They were scared that the national government would become too strong. They thought the Constitution left the states too weak. The Anti-Federalists actually liked the Articles of Confederation. And they believed that the Constitution gave the president too much power like a king. So in an effort before the Constitution was written and ratified at the Constitutional Convention, the Anti-Federalists demanded that there be a Bill of Rights or something that would protect the people's individual rights. Okay, take a minute. You can pause the video. You can copy that down. Remember, you can stop and jot. You don't have to write full sentences. The second group is the Federalists. These are people who are pro-big government. So they wanted a strong national government to work out state problems. And they, on the opposite, they disliked the Articles of Confederation. They thought that the Constitution already protected individual rights, so they didn't think there was a need for a Bill of Rights. And there's going to be a group of people who write the Federalist Papers that is just really a series of essays promoting the promoting the Constitution. These include James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now, if you skip down, big question number 1, how should states be represented in Congress and how many representatives does each state have? There's two very differing ideas that come out at first. Big states wanted representation based on population. The bigger the state, the more people there were, the more representation they would have. The small states wanted equal representation. Remember, their population is much smaller, so a state like New Jersey, they feel, should have the same amount of representation as a larger state like Virginia. So there's the first plan, the Virginia Plan. This plan was created by James Madison, and in this plan they wanted 3 branches of government, the legislative, executive, and judicial branch, which is something that we still have today. Although he wanted the legislative branch would have 2 houses, meaning the Senate and the House of Reps, and he wanted that based on population. Okay, so it's kind of giving an unfair advantage to the larger states that have more people in them. On the flip side, you have the New Jersey plan, who was presented by Patterson, And they wanted three branches of government as well, so you can see there's an agreement there. But the difference is their legislative branch would have one house. Each state would get one vote. So they wanted equal representation, one per state. So you can see that these two ideas are different in that they wanted one per state, one vote per state in the New Jersey plan, and the Virginia plan was based on population. They both wanted three branches of government, so that's something that they agreed upon. What ends up taking place, if you flip your notes to the next page, is that we end up with the Great Compromise. In the Great Compromise, it's proposed by Roger Sherman. You have three branches of government. The legislative branch would have two houses, which means bicameral. Bi meaning two. Bicameral legislature, which gives us a Senate, which has every state getting two representatives. So if you think of today, we have 50 states. Our Senate has 100 people, two per state. And then the other side is the House of Representatives, which is based on population. So the population of the House of Representatives is based on how many people live within a state. Currently, we have 435 members of the House of Representatives. A state like New York has far more people represented in the House than, say, a state like Wyoming that has a population that's far, far less. So, Senate representation is equal, it's two per state, and in the House, representation is based on population. The Senate is more tailored to the New Jersey plan, equal representation, and the House is based more upon the Virginia plan, that is based on the state's population. At the same time, big question number 2, should slaves be counted in determining representation? What we found out was that obviously Southerners wanted to include slaves in the population count because they had a far greater number of slaves in the South than in the North. Northerners did not want this to happen. For example, in North Carolina, if there were 100,000 slaves, they would get an extra population of 60,000 people, which in the end would add more people into the House of Representatives in those states. So what ends up happening is the small and large states come to a compromise called the 3/5 Compromise. In this, it said that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of its population. So going back up to this number, if you had 100,000 slaves in North Carolina, 3/5 of that is 60,000. And then big question number 3, should Congress have the power to ban the slave trade? What ends up happening is Southerners did not want Congress to end the slave trade because they obviously needed the workforce and relied on it heavily. Congress agreed that they would not outlaw slavery for at least 20 years. So if you're doing the math, it's 1787 is the Constitutional Convention. They're going to not even touch it or discuss it until 1807. That concludes the notes portion. That's more like the textbook version of the notes, going about how we first started with the Articles of Confederation. They found it to be very weak, so they end up going to a constitutional convention in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. They figure out that the Articles should just be scrapped and they start new, and that's where we get our Constitution being written. In the next 3 weeks, we'll study the Constitution. We'll look at different parts of the Senate, the House of Representatives, the judicial, executive, and legislative branch, how a bill becomes a law, the amendment process. These notes really just lay a foundation for where we'll go in the next couple of weeks and what our country will do to survive. In signing the Constitution, it was September 17th, 1787. 9 out of the 13 states signed the Constitution, and it was officially a new government in the United States of America. And then this, you don't have to take notes, but just a quick graphic. Connecting to the essential question, how did Americans create a national government that respected both the independence of the states and the rights of the individuals? We'll actually take a look at this later on in the week, but you can see the Confederation, this is the Articles of Confederation, and most of these really are a lot of weaknesses compared to what the new government does. and how they tried to revise the Articles and they scrapped it and made a new constitution that gives power both to the federal government and to the states in a way to compromise.